All right. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Trevor Drake from the Great Plains Institute. Thanks for joining us today. This is a webinar to go over the stakeholder engagement process for Minnesota Public Utilities Commission docket 17-401, a commission investigation to identify and develop performance metrics and potentially incentives for Xcel Energy's electric utility operations. This webinar is just going to cover the basics of the stakeholder engagement process that we have laid out and a little bit of background on utility performance regulation as well. And let me check, are folks seeing my screen? Jordana, can you confirm for me?
I'm seeing your screen.
Okay, thank you. So here's the agenda that we have teed up for today. In a moment, Rolf Nordstrom is just going to do a brief welcome on this topic. And then Tim Wolf from Synapse Energy Economics is going to provide an overview on utility performance metrics. We'll then have an overview of the PUC order that came out in this docket in January, and more information on the stakeholder engagement process. And then finally, time for questions at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Rolf Nordstrom, President and CEO of Great Plains Institute.
Hey, thanks, Trevor. And thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I really am just going to take a couple minutes, but I wanted to take those few minutes to try to put this process that we're all about to embark on to develop performance metrics into a slightly larger context. Probably many people on this call, if you've joined this call, you probably know that Minnesota actually has a long history of establishing performance outcomes for its regulated utilities and establishing metrics to determine whether or not those outcomes were met. So in many respects, this conversation we're about to have over the next, say, 9 months is not new. Indeed, as many of you know, there are already lots and lots of performance metrics that are tracked and measured today for traditional performance outcomes that people in the sector that have been happening, say, over the last decade and more, including the desire for customers to have more choices, changes in distributed energy technologies, the grid itself becoming more computerized and intelligent, necessarily so, in order to flexibly manage supply and demand more nimbly, and then the widely shared goal now among regulators and Xcel Energy and its customers of decarbonizing the production of electricity. All of that has led the Commission to establish some additional performance outcomes in addition to affordability and reliability, and have now given us in this docket these 5. And so to those first 2, they've now added customer service quality, which of course is not really new. That too has been around a long time, but I think one could make a good argument that while it's been a long-standing desired outcome, the whole idea of what service means today in this new environment might need some conversation and some updating. And then the other 2 performance outcomes being environmental performance and cost-effective alignment of generation and load, including demand response. So we've been given the gift of having pretty clear performance outcomes in front of us, and now this process is going to be devoted to having us all get clear on what those mean in practice, and then coming up with what are the right ways to measure performance against those. And I guess my main thought here that I want to sort of frame today's webinar with is, rather than viewing this current Commission docket on performance metrics as something of a mechanical exercise that's just about developing performance metrics, I guess I would invite everyone to think about this docket and the evolution of the electric system together, sort of opening up this historic opportunity, frankly, for everybody, for all of you, to stand back, take a few steps back, and contemplate what outcomes you really want to see the utilities deliver. And of course, the outcomes themselves, the big categories have been set, but more deeply, how do you think, what are the specific things that might fit in those 5 outcome buckets, and then how should we be measuring them? So that's all I wanted to say by way of preamble. I want to thank Tim Wolf for joining us for this webinar, who's going to give you a little bit more context so that everybody sort of kind of a level setting presentation on performance metrics. So Tim, thanks again so much for joining us for this.
Sure,
Rolf.
my pleasure.
Trevor Drake again here from GPI. I am just going to do a brief intro for Tim, and while we do that, we are going to transfer control of the webinar, so you'll see that changing on your screen. We're so happy to have Tim Wolf with us. He is a Senior Vice President at Synapse Energy Economics. He has more than 35 years of experience conducting technical and economic analyses of energy and environmental issues on behalf of a variety of consumer advocates, environmental advocates, regulators, and government agencies. In recent years, Tim's focused on policies and analyses related to power sector transformation. He also served as a commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities from 2007 to 2011. Tim, please take it away, and thanks so much for being with us today.
Sure. I hope you can all see my screen and hear me okay.
We can.
Here's a quick outline. First of all, I'll say I was asked to give a fairly high-level introductory presentation, so that's what I'm going to do. But I am saving some time at the end, maybe 10 minutes or so, for questions and answers if people want to go into any more details on what I'm covering. So please keep that in mind. What we're going to cover is the role of performance incentive mechanisms in the context of any regulatory setting. It's important to put it in the right context. Talk about the 4 discrete components of performance incentive mechanisms. And I'll talk about a bit about terminology too. It's important to get the terminology right. Specific concepts and ideas about performance incentives, metrics in Minnesota. Talk about different types of PIMs. There's 3 different types it's useful to keep in mind as we go forward. I have some examples from other states, and it's always important to talk about pitfalls because there are several, and I always make sure to remind people of those. So starting at a very high level, it's important to think of how performance incentive mechanisms fit in with the regulatory system that you have in place. And here, it's a slide I often use to try to put the different pieces together. One element or one regulatory approach is the cost of service regulation, which is compared to the multi-year rate plans. And I hear that in Minnesota, you now have a multi-year rate plan. And so it's important to think through how performance incentive mechanisms fit into that. And I'll point out that PIMs can be applied in either type of regulation. They can be applied under any kind of regulation. So it's important to keep in mind that they're separate and distinct from multi-year rate plans, but they might have different roles, or there might be a different set of PIMs depending upon your current regulatory setting. In the past, under cost of service regulation, PIMs have primarily focused on safety and reliability and customer service. As we're moving forward and more states are looking into multi-year rate plans, they're being expanded to include incentives for a whole variety of outcomes, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. So a little more on just the regulatory context. It's critical to recognize that each model, and as you know, every state has its own model. Every state is different. That it has its own embedded incentives. And so performance incentive mechanisms can help address or offset these incentives, whether it's to increase sales, build rate base, or whether there's a lack of incentive to innovate or a lack of incentive to pursue regulatory goals. Those are all factors to consider as you're setting up your own PIMs. And the other thing is, are there regulatory goals that are not fully addressed in your current regulatory context? And if so, what are they and how to address them? And so one of the great things about PIMs is that they can help articulate goals and provide those incentives. This is all to say that there's no cookie cutter approach to applying PIMs in one state or another. It really does depend upon what each state is doing. Quick overview of PIMs. And this is partly to distinguish PIMs from multi-year rate plans. but it's also just to provide sort of the context I'm going to get into in a minute. The objective is to articulate specific goals. Unlike multi-year rate plans, where the incentives and the directives from the Commission are fairly broad, basically they're incentives to be more efficient overall, to reduce operating costs and so forth. PIMs are different. They are focused on specific goals. They allow for tracking of performance, and they allow for specific incentives for those improved performance. So now this is important. Key components. I'm going to talk a lot about this. There's 4 different components to PIMs. There's the goals, metrics, targets, and financial incentives. And I believe you've already established goals pretty well in Minnesota. I've looked briefly at the recent Commission order. And I also understand that right now the primary focus of the stakeholder discussion is going to be on metrics. So I'm going to talk almost entirely about metrics. But it's important to place metrics in the context of the overall performance incentive mechanisms that includes targets and financial incentives, because the metrics often provide a foundation upon which targets and then financial incentives are built. There are also a variety of optional components, benchmarking relative to other utilities, scorecards and public reporting. I'm not going to go into that much, but just to note that there's other pieces to this puzzle, even for just metrics alone, that can be included as well. So back to this point about there being 4 discrete components, it's helpful to understand them and why they can actually be done independently. There might be reasons to take steps 1 and 2, but not 3 and 4, and so forth. And it might also be appropriate to implement steps 1, 2, and 3, but then wait before you move to the 4th one. So performance areas, the main thing here is to identify those areas that really require more utility attention. And as I mentioned, they should be based upon state goals and desired outcomes. It's almost always best to articulate these first. Sometimes it doesn't happen, and there's a little confusion as to what you're trying to achieve. But that's kind of this starts the foundation for the other 3 steps. Then metrics are there to provide information. It's really all they are, is just pure information, but can be very important, powerful information. And they should be specific to the performance areas and the regulatory goals, so they build off those, the first step. Targets go a step further in that they provide guidance on how utilities should perform. So if a metric happens to be, for example, tons of CO2 emissions per year, and a target would be not just whatever the tons are, but it would say the utility needs to meet X tons per year. So it's a higher level, it's a bit more guidance from the regulators as to what to be expected. Targets almost always build off metrics. You pretty much have to have a metric to apply a target. And sometimes it may make sense to put the metrics in place first, monitor them over a year or a couple of years, and then set targets. Then you have some information to build off of. And then the 4th key component, financial incentives, is literally to provide dollar incentives to the utilities, whether it's rewards or penalties. This element, this component of the whole picture, provides typically the greatest opportunities for improvement, but also the greatest risks for the utilities and the customers. Again, these should build off of the targets, and there should be metrics for them. Usually, the financial incentives would only be applied to a subset of the targets, but not always. And again, it may make sense as you get into financial incentives, especially since they're riskier, to take a year or more to monitor how the targets are going before you actually set incentives. So taking the same concept and getting a little bit more closer to Minnesota, my understanding is the Commission has already established performance areas. I guess there's the 5 that you see here. And as you'll see in a minute, these are not that different from what other states do. So this is a fine place to start. They're fairly broad to cover the key priorities. I don't really have any comments on those. Now the metrics, I also understand that the Commission has established a set of principles for how to define the metrics. So here, I just repeat those. They're condensed a little bit. They're familiar principles that I've seen before. I didn't see any that are really missing. And I think you've probably all seen them before, so I'm not going to walk through every one of them. But it is important that these be adhered to pretty much for every metric and thought through as you come up with the detailed formulas. And if you stick to these, then you're less likely to suffer from some of the pitfalls that I'm going to mention a bit later on. So you don't often see them described this way, but I think it's helpful to explain that PIMs can take three different forms. Sometimes there's a gray area between them, but typically they fall into one of these three categories. One I call outcome-based, which is where the regulators define, what outcome do we want? And doesn't really define specific programs or actions to get there. One of the obvious one might be, reduce peak demand or improve load factor. And what happens is the advantage there is the utility has complete flexibility to be thoughtful, creative, come up with new ideas to achieve them. And it's not sort of driven by regulatory oversight or what one might call micromanagement. It's give the utility incentive and let them run with it. And this has a lot of appeal to a lot of people because it does just that. It gives utility flexibility and doesn't require too much oversight. The trick is that if you're not careful here, then you can step into some of the pitfalls. But otherwise, it's generally a pretty receives a lot of attention and a lot of interest by a lot of parties. Program-based are different, where the PIMs are based on a specific program that is overseen by regulators and stakeholders. One of the key examples here is energy efficiency shareholder incentives. In fact, it turns out that so many states have efficiency shareholder incentives that I think it's the most commonly applied PIM throughout the United States. And one of the advantages is it gives very specific regulatory direction in terms of the programs have to be cost effective and which specific programs, all the policies that a state applies towards energy efficiency programs and all the regulatory oversight that is there anyways, then gets applied on top of the performance incentive mechanism. So in this case, the regulatory oversight typically already exists, and it often exists in terms of monitoring and verification and all the rest. And so that isn't even so much of a downside. The only downside here might be, well, what if the utility could do something different? And does this allow for innovation? And then the third type is action-based. You don't see as many of these, but they are kind of common. And these are specific utility actions that the utility is directed to do to get to a certain outcome. It might not include certain targets like megawatts or megawatt-hour savings. And it's typically used to help facilitate a transformation or a move to a different way of doing things. So one great example is providing customers and third parties with end-use data, which is the kind of thing the utility might do at a one-time basis, or at least get something done in the first couple of years. After it's done, there's no need to continue it. But it's really important to help facilitate the transformation to more market participation, more customer engagement, and so forth. So I mentioned these three types because they all have their different strengths and weaknesses. And we've done some work on this and found that relying on any one of them too much is a little dangerous. And that because of the strengths and weaknesses of each, it might be good to have a mix of all three. And I can talk more about the details about that later if people have questions or as you all get further on down in your workshops. So I'm going to go over a couple of examples, and I think this might be helpful just to put some concrete information in front of you as you go down this road. one of the things I'll say is that there are a million ways to do this, and no one way is right. You'll see some themes across the 3 states that I'm talking about, I'm going to refer to, but that doesn't mean that those themes have to apply to Minnesota. You maybe have different priorities. But anyway, dig in. Rhode Island has gone through a couple years now of what they call a power sector transformation discussion. And in the middle of all that, National Grid came in with a rate case and proposed a set of performance incentive mechanisms. And the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers submitted some counter proposals. I worked for the division, and so this represents what that agency proposed. I'm putting it here because it's A, it's public, and B, I like it. That's why I put it together. So really briefly, we have 3 types of PIMs here: system efficiency, distributed energy resources, and then support for power sector transformation. It turns out that these also fall within the categories of outcome-based at the top, and then program-based, more or less, in the middle, and then action-based at the bottom. And for system efficiency, the PIM was to reduce transmission peaks relative to forecast, both transmission peaks, and then also FCM stands for the full capacity market, the generation peaks. And I will say that in all 3 of these examples, I'm talking about performance incentive mechanisms that include metrics, targets, and financial incentives. But they're useful because there's a metric underlying every one of these. And so that's somewhat helpful for where you're going. Then for distributed energy resources, there's a lot of attention on these in Rhode Island now. There are several programs that the utilities running to implement them. And so we put forward a PIM with metrics behind them for every one of these initiatives you see here. I'm not going to walk through every one of them, but you can see pretty much all the types of DERs are covered there one way or the other. And then at the bottom, several action incentives, action-based incentives for supporting low income, participation in DER incentives and enrollment, customer information, and then improving peak demand forecasting to help support the third parties develop their market. So this is a snapshot of what was proposed in Rhode Island. In the end, I think the commission adopted several fewer than what is listed here, but I don't think the order has been finalized, so that's still up in the air. But anyway, that's Rhode Island. Going to move on now. New York. I'm sure you've heard a lot about the New York REV process, and just quickly, they have similar categories. They have system efficiency, customer engagement, interconnection, a clean energy standard, which is like an RPS, but it includes more than renewables, energy efficiency, and market development. And for system efficiency, they have several outcome-based approaches. One is system utilization, which covers load factor and so forth. Another is peak reduction, penetration of distributed energy resources, and utilization of DER. So it's a slightly different take on the same concept. Customer engagement is a big part of what they're trying to achieve in New York. So they have a set of PIMs on time of use rate, customer satisfaction, customer enhancement, and I'll say that customer satisfaction in terms of complaints and response times, those are done like pretty much everywhere, a lot of places, but customer enhancement, engagement, affordability, those are new. And so there's a whole set of new ones there in New York. Affordability, also, this is a hard one to put into a metric in a PIM, but there's a couple places where states are trying to do so. And then interconnection, this is kind of key to make sure that the DERs are given access to the grid. Clean energy standard, as I mentioned, it's a broad kind of RPS, and they talk about carbon reductions, conversion of fossil fuel, beneficial electrification. And for each of these, there's a set of metrics to try to demonstrate compliance. Energy efficiency, interesting. They have one of the top incremental savings is a program-based to make sure the programs do what they're supposed to do. The two on the bottom are outcomes-based. That is, residential energy intensity. How much energy does a residential customer typically use? I think that might be in, like, by a customer class, residential customers, gigawatt hours per customer. And same with commercial. Now, those are actually outcome-based, and they have a lot of appeal, but they have a lot of challenges in terms of measuring and verifying and making sure that they're done in a way that's not rewarding the utility for what otherwise would have happened. So each one of these has its own interesting story. And then finally, market development. They call distributed system platform their approach to modernizing and modifying the distribution utility so that it acts as a platform. So first, there's a set of PIMs on creating the platform, then there's a set of PIMs on developing the market that can work off of that, and then market-based revenues. So pretty broad range in New York. There's more details if people want it from, obviously, from the Commission's website. And then finally, the final example from Hawaii. Again, I mentioned Hawaii because we're working there quite a bit, and I'm working there for the consumer advocate. They're going through a very similar process that Minnesota is. I think they may be really just a few months ahead, maybe a half a year ahead. And right now they're having a broad-ranging discussion about metrics and metrics only. And here I list, just very briefly, I'm not going to go over all of these, the metrics proposed by the consumer advocate in a recent brief filed to the Commission. And you'll see that the outcome categories are starting to look familiar. There's affordability, reliability, and they can add resilience and cybersecurity. There's interconnection, customer engagement and equity, and customer satisfaction. By the way, there is a longer list of outcomes that the consumer advocate didn't provide metrics on because there's not so much interest to them, but other parties will. And then I note here that Hawaii already has a set of existing metrics. Some of them are really well documented and reported on the websites for each utility. I highly recommend you take a look at those. They're very easy to find. And then for each of these outcomes, there's a whole long list of new metrics. And as you can see, the list starts to get long, and there's lots of different ways to slice and dice it. We could have gone even longer, but decided to keep it to this. So it's a heads up that there's a lot of ways to do this, and lots of choices, which can make a difference later on as you're building on top of these. The last thing I'll say before I allow for questions is pitfalls. I always make sure to put something in my presentations on this because they do look like a really helpful regulatory mechanism to focus utility incentives and directions and their actions, but one has to be wary because there's been a history of them going awry. It's just the way it is. So I always give people a heads up. One of them is undue rewards or penalties. If the utility has paid for something it should do anyways. You have to make sure customer costs don't outweigh the benefits. You have to avoid unintended consequences where the utility's focus gets shifted for one incentive when it's not paying enough attention to another performance area. Regulatory burden that sometimes happens if the metrics and incentives are not clearly defined and they're contentious. Uncertainty, if, again, they're not clearly defined, they provide incorrect signals. And finally, gaming and manipulation. You don't want to create an incentive for the utility to somehow rig the PIMs so that they get rewarded when they shouldn't and so forth. And without meaning to cast aspersions on anybody, there have been several examples of utilities in the past gaming these because that's where they have an incentive to do so. So it's our job to make sure that doesn't happen. And one of the key things here I'll point out is that almost all of these pitfalls are driven by the financial incentives. That is, once you add financial incentives to this equation, the PIMs equation, then suddenly all of these become much more relevant. Without them, they're much, much less relevant, every single one of them. So for your purposes in Minnesota, where you're now at a point where you're focusing on metrics, you don't have to worry so much about these. However, as I said before, the metrics provide the foundation upon which the targets and the financial incentives are built. So you want to make sure that you adhere to the principles in how you define the metrics. We mentioned them earlier, clarity and ease of reporting and recognizing and evaluating. All of those principles, important to get right so that by the time you do add financial incentives on top of them, you can avoid these pitfalls. So that's the quick overview. I hope that's helpful, and I have, I think a good 10 minutes or so for questions and answers if people have any.
Great, thanks so much, Tim. That was indeed helpful. We do have time for just a few questions. So I welcome you to chat your questions in. You can hover your mouse down either at the bottom or top of your screen and find the chat function. I see that Lissa Polish has found the chat function and has a question. And Lissa, I've unmuted you, so please go ahead.
Hey, Tim. Thanks so much for that presentation. I had a couple different questions, but maybe I'll start with just one. For the Rhode Island examples, you had a few different examples that included things being based on what was deemed cost-effective. So cost-effective storage, cost-effective electric heat. Can you say a little bit more about what the thinking was or how that cost effectiveness was determined? Is that included in the metrics, or maybe describe that a bit more?
Great question. One thing I'll clarify is I have two slides on Rhode Island. I only included this one. The first slide has what National Grid proposed, and the second slide is what you're looking at now on the screen. And here I underline the differences. So what we did, representing the consumer advocate, was to agree, okay, for demand response, we're fine getting a metric, an incentive for increased megawatt enrollment, but only if it's cost effective. So that can be kind of tricky, but if you have a program-based performance incentive metric, or even a metric in general, it's easier to do that because, for example, if it's an efficiency program, you in Minnesota and every state that I know of has a pretty well-established way to determine what's cost-effective and what is not. So that's what is meant here. And another example, if looking at like storage, we have that as well, electric heat initiative. We're getting a little bit into the financial incentives part of this, but I think it's important to say that the way we worked it out was that the utility would be allowed to earn a sharing of the savings, the net benefits from the meter, in this case, behind the meter storage program. And if it turned out that they implemented a behind the meter storage program that was not cost effective, there'd be no net benefits and they'd get no incentives. But if they did it and they did it well, there'd be a net benefit and they'd get a share of that. So that's what was meant when I emphasized that here. Last point is that some of this is just really hard to do in a way that's cost effective, but we argue that if you build this up slowly, incrementally, from metrics to targets to financial incentives, then it will give you the information you need to at least get a good assumption, a good estimate of what's going to be cost effective.
Great, thanks, Tim. Looking for other questions here. I just see a comment coming from Joe Damel at the Attorney General's office, which is to say that Hawaii adopted the PIM design process and steps that were also adopted here in Minnesota. They're ahead of where we are, but are a good example of a state, albeit a very different one, implementing PIMs in a deliberate, stepwise manner. So, and Tim, I think you mentioned that, so good to just reiterate that. Hawaii will certainly be an example to look at as we go through this.
Yeah, and by the way, as a participant in the discussions in Hawaii, I've heard lots of reference to Minnesota, so I think you're both kind of in parallel processes.
Great. Any other questions for Tim at this time? All right, and we'll have a little bit more time for questions at the end. Tim, thanks again for walking through that. That was extremely helpful to frame up the topic and just understand more of the context here. So I am going to take back over control of my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Doug Scott, who is with us here at GPI and is going to provide just an overview of what was in that most recent PUC order.
Thanks, Trevor. Hope everybody can hear me okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
Great, thanks. So most of you probably know this, but just by way of background, we wanted to provide everybody on the webinar, and we'll talk about this as we go through the process as well. But the PUC order of January 8th of this year, in pertinent part, talked about how the Commission is adopting the Office of Attorney General's performance incentive mechanism process and associated goals, outcomes, and metrics hierarchy with focus on steps 1 through 4. And we're going to go through those in just a minute. And for those of you who participate in other discussions on performance incentive mechanisms in Minnesota over the last year, you've seen this diagram before that was provided through the Attorney General's office. The Commission order essentially did for the discussion, took care of boxes 1 and 2, in that it articulated goals and identified the desired outcomes. And so the stakeholder process that Trevor's going to talk about in just a minute that we're embarking on today and that will run through October of this year is going to be working on the performance metrics and establishing metrics and review. And then the other 3 steps are ones that would be done later down the line. Next slide. So the goals of the regulation, and again, this is all pulled directly from the PUC order of January 8th. So if you need to go back and find any of this, you can find it all, what I'm going to go through in the next couple of slides, all right from the order. So looking at the rates, investments, and returns by the IOUs in Minnesota, the goals of the regulation are, as has been stated a little bit earlier, I believe Rolf went through these at the beginning, environmental protection, adequate, efficient, and reasonable service, reasonable rates, and the opportunity for regulated entities to receive a return on their investment, sort of the what a lot of people call the regulatory compact in a lot of places. The desired outcomes then, these again are things that Rolf talked about early on, and they're very familiar to everyone who's gone through and looked at energy regulatory policy over the last several years. The one difference that you may find in Minnesota that isn't necessarily there in every other state is the environmental performance, including carbon reductions and beneficial electrification. But affordability, reliability, customer service, and cost-effective alignment of generation and load, which of course plays into both reliability and affordability and into customer service quality. Those are all things that commissions here in Minnesota and in other places throughout the country always have and probably always will concern themselves with. Next slide. So the metric design principles. So the commission in their order in January said that as this discussion takes place, they are going to be looking, the commission is going to be looking for metric design principles that accomplish the goals that are listed there in the 7 bullet points. And I won't read them for you, you can read them on the screen, but the idea there is, I think the idea there is the same idea that are the concepts that Tim has talked about, what other states are looking at all over the country, are metrics that are easily measured, easily interpreted, easily verified, ones that don't leave a lot of discussion or room for argument, that people can in a very, very public and a very transparent way understand not only what the metrics are, but how they're measured and whether or not a utility has achieved those metrics. Again, complement and inform other methods of evaluating utility performance that the commission might go through. And again, these are all things that in performance metrics throughout the country, these are very often cited goals. Trevor?
Great, thanks, Doug. Yeah, this is Trevor Drake again with GPI. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the stakeholder process. So we have 4 high-level objectives for the process. First is to just raise the level of education among stakeholders so that we can have a well-informed discussion. And this webinar is one of the steps to help do that. Second, this is a big one, identify a draft set of metrics. These can be existing or new under each of those commission-established outcomes that 1, indicate progress on that outcome, and 2, comport with those design principles that Doug just covered. 3, we're going to seek to develop recommendations for metric reporting, including how they should be calculated and verified. And then lastly, just to identify, clarify, and document commentary and discussion along the way. So here's the stakeholder process we've laid out. You'll see 2 rows that are aligned to those 2 steps in the PIM design process. Here we are today on the webinar. First meeting is going to be on February 20th. And the goal of that meeting is going to be to develop an initial list of metrics deserving further evaluation. Following that meeting, we'll then have a comment period. So it'll be an opportunity to evaluate the metrics that came out of February 20th and evaluate them, especially against those design principles. We'll then have another meeting at the beginning of reply comments, and that will lead to a commission hearing in June to decide on metrics advancing to discuss calculation and reporting. Following that, we then got step 4. So we'll have the metrics coming out of the commission hearing in June. And the goal of this second part of the year is just to figure out for the metrics we established, so sort of deciding what is it we want to measure, then how should that be measured? So identifying procedures for calculation, verification, and reporting on those metrics as stated in the design principles. And I'll say, as you can see, we're sort of mimicking the first phase of the process in the second one, but we are open to adjusting this as needed. So this is the plan for now, but we leave open the opportunity to adjust this as we go. The other thing I should emphasize in this is that the commission will be basing its deliberations based on comments submitted into the record. So those comment periods that are sort of bracketed in those blue bars are key to developing the record. The meetings will be an important opportunity to get educated and understand one another's perspectives, but we do want folks to really focus on submitting their comments in those periods. And then here's what to expect for February 20th. We have 3 objectives. First, and primarily, is to develop an initial list of metrics under each of those commission-established outcomes, sorted into 4 buckets. And those buckets are, 1, metrics that stakeholders generally agree should be used for that outcome. Metrics stakeholders generally agree should not be used for that outcome. Metrics on which stakeholders disagree. So one party may think that a metric is excellent under a specific outcome, and another party might think it's not so good. We're not necessarily seeking to resolve that on February 20th. We just want to understand those perspectives and document them, and then folks can think through those and make their points in the comment period. And then lastly, we expect there may be some metrics that just need more information to decide if they should fit into those 3 buckets above. In addition to that, we are not going to be doing a thorough evaluation of the metrics against the design principles at that meeting. But if there are comments or questions that come up, we will, of course, be capturing those, as well as thoughts about how metrics might be consolidated or streamlined. So those last 2 objectives are not primary objectives, but we will be capturing commentary. So important next steps. February 20th is an all-day meeting. It's from 8 to 4:30 at Surly Brewing Company in St. Paul. Here's the link if you'd like to register. We'll send that out after as well. We are expecting folks to engage for the full day. We do not want folks coming in and leaving for certain parts. We think it's important to be there for the full conversation since these metrics are interrelated. We will also be sending out a survey to folks who are registered for that meeting. So look for that in the next few days. That will be an opportunity to give some initial thoughts on metrics that will be discussed at the meeting. However, we will not be discarding any metrics as a result of that survey. So what we've done is compiled all the metrics, and there are quite a few of them that have already been suggested in the docket to date. And we're just looking for some initial thoughts on those to frame up the discussion and put us off on the right foot on February 20th. if you have any questions about the process, please feel free to contact me. My email is there. And you can also contact any of us at GPI or commission staff as well. So we have 15 minutes now for questions. There are two ways to ask a question. You can submit it into the chat box, and I think you can just hover your mouse up or down on your screen and find the chat. I believe you can also unmute yourself, so I welcome you to do either of those things. And I will stand by and await any questions. And these could be on the process, on the order, or on anything that Tim presented as well. Just giving folks a moment here to type in. We've got a question here from Lissa again. Do you have a sense for how many metrics might be a good number? Like, is it 10? Is it 4? I'm actually going to, Tim, if you're still on, I'm going to see if you have a response to that based on your experience. Is there do you have a sense for, how many metrics is too many?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. As I've mentioned before, metrics are relatively low cost and low risk. Some utilities disagree because they have to, take some effort to collect the data, but in general, compared to other regulatory mechanisms, they're pretty low cost. So I prefer to err on the side of more metrics rather than fewer. And I think it does depend upon the outcomes. If you have, for example, affordability is one of your outcomes, and you can think of 8 different ways to measure that, then I would not take some out because you're worried about having too many. I would err on the side of having too many. So, and I think on the order of 5 or 10, as you can see from the previous examples, will be way too low. If you've already got, 4 or 5 outcomes that you're seeking or goals, I could easily see 5 to 10 for each one.
Okay, thanks, Tim. That is helpful. I will just say there are a lot of metrics that have been suggested in the docket to date. I think we're around 200. So we have our work cut out for us. Another question from Joe Dammel at the Attorney General's office. It's a process question, and the question is, will you be submitting the meeting reports to the docket, and will the PUC issue notices of comment periods following these reports? And the answer is yes. So just bringing up the process here again, following meeting 1, that report will just detail what came out of the meeting and commentary. That will then kick off the comment period. So you will be able to respond to that meeting report in your comments, and the PUC will indeed be noticing those comment periods. We've got Michelle Rebholz and Kelly Martone on the line. Michelle and Kelly, did you want to say anything else about the comment periods? And I suppose I have to unmute you, so I'm doing that now. Kelly, I've unmuted you, and Michelle, it looks like you're unmuted.
Nope, I think you covered it, Trevor. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Bridget, Doctor from Excel Energy, asks, will the PowerPoints be made available to attendees? I'm assuming you mean from this webinar, and yes, we will make them available, and also for the meetings as well. We will make PowerPoints available. From Michael O'Boyle at Energy Innovation, following up on Lissa's question, how should we think of prioritizing outcome-based, program-based, or action-based outcomes as stakeholders develop this initial list? Tim, it seems like this is a good question for you.
Yeah, prioritizing is important. As I said earlier, I think having a range of all 3 types actually makes some sense. I have more reservations about outcome-based than I do about the others, which I could go into if it's helpful. But if you're going to have some of those, it's also good to have program and outcome. And in terms of priorities, here's how I've thought it through, is that start with a broad range of metrics. As I said a minute ago, there's no harm in having lots of them. And then when you need to then prioritize, that you start doing that when you come up with your targets. And you look at your current metrics and you say, okay, which of these are subpar? Which of these performance indicators and performance areas are the utilities not doing as well as one might like? And so you use those to prioritize your targets. And then you do the same thing once again after that. Okay, well, which of the targets are the utilities not really achieving very well? And that helps you prioritize what your financial incentives might be. But you don't need to do that so much at this stage. At this stage, you want to get the information in front of yourselves and the commission to then help prioritize after that.
Wonderful, thank you. Luke Hollenkamp from the city of Minneapolis is asking, should metrics have a magnitude of importance? For instance, should there be primary versus secondary metrics as we're working to develop this set of metrics? And Tim, seems like this could go to you as well.
Sure, and I think that goes back to the outcomes. There might be certain outcomes that people want to place a greater emphasis on, and that might vary by parties. So affordability might be especially important to some and less to others. So there's certainly no reason you can't have that kind of a categorization of highest priority versus second highest, primary, secondary. I think the main thing though is, even if something's secondary, you might want to gather the data, because you might find that the data tells you, oh, wait a second, this should be more of a priority. So it's again all about getting the data.
Thanks, Tim. Any other questions from folks? That, I think, is it for what I'm seeing in the chat box, but I will stand by for just another moment to see if folks have additional questions. And I do believe you may be able to unmute yourself as well in the participant list.
Hey, Trevor, I have a quick one for Tim. This is Doug.
Yeah.
Tim, following up on the questions that Lissa and Michael asked you, when you're identifying all of the metrics, I mean, I think a lot of people think that identifying metrics means you have to have financial incentives tied to them, but that's not necessarily true, right?
Correct. That's extremely important.
Yeah.
You can collect dozens and dozens of metrics and never put financial incentive on them because you may not need to.
Right. Okay. Thanks. I just wanted to make sure that was we clarified that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just explain that just because you don't put a financial incentive on it doesn't mean that the metric wasn't useful. It can be extremely useful in, first of all, targets, but even in letting you know whether you need a financial incentive. And sometimes just highlighting the performance type and outcome that the commission is seeking is enough to focus the utility attention on it without even having to apply a financial incentive.
Thank you.
Thanks, that's helpful. I've got a question here from Pat Sharkey. Don't we need a base of factual information on which to base our identification and evaluation of any given metric? How do we develop that information? So, and Tim, I'll throw this to you as well, but yeah, how are we basing metrics on fact, and how are we evaluating the quality of a metric?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. You want to have as much historical evidence as you can to basically populate your metrics. And there may be some, just trying to think of an example, maybe it's CO2 emissions from all your fossil plants that you already have, in which case you've got your historical information. There may be some where you don't have that information, and so That's why I advocate for getting your metrics in place early and making them broad and collecting the data right away. And it might take a year, it may take several years before you have enough historical-based evidence to set a target. And then you may even need more time to set up a financial incentive. So start as soon as you can, and you'll get the information as needed. And the other thing I'll say is, like, sometimes you can take performance from neighboring utilities or neighboring states that might help, at least to some extent, guide how utility performance should be for certain metrics.
Thanks. And I'll also add, just to Pat's question, in this process that we've laid out, one of the reasons we've split up identifying the metrics and then identifying that calculation and reporting procedure is so that there is sort of a check part way to say, yeah, we definitely want to measure this somehow, and we're going to have to figure out exactly how to do that. But then there's an opportunity to say, actually, we wanted to measure this, but now that we've looked at the procedure, it's going to be really difficult, and maybe we're questioning that. So probably the list of metrics that goes through will be good, and there won't be issues. But if that happens to come up in this second phase, we do have the opportunity to have that discussion. Got another question here from Jody Londo from Excel Energy. Jody's asking, will you be distributing information in advance of the February 20th workshop? Yes, we'll be sending out a pre-read. And then she also asks, for example, the list of the 200 potential metrics identified thus far that I mentioned. Yes, we will be sending that out, and the survey that we're sending out will include those and is intended to get stakeholders' initial thoughts on that list of metrics. Help us determine, are there ones that everybody's really excited about, and are there ones that already everybody seems to think, yeah, maybe this isn't a good fit. That will put us off on the right foot on February 20th. So with just a few minutes left, I will pause here once more just to see if there are other questions. All right, seeing and hearing none, I want to thank Tim Wolf for presenting here, and Rolf as well for giving us that welcome. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today to learn more about this. Just to recap next steps. So first in-person meeting is on February 20th. The registration link is there, and I believe we put that into the chat box, and we'll be sending it out as well. Once you register, look for an email in the next few days with that survey. Also look for more information from us as the meeting gets closer. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is there. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great day.